All right, good morning. So I'm Eric Williams. I'm the Director of Provider Development, and I'm joined today by Amy Braswell. She is our Provider Team Lead. And we are going to kind of take some time today to look at data, our most recent data, to identify gaps in services and to discuss ways to increase service availability where we see needs. So we're going to do something a little bit different today in terms of how we approach the information. Typically, we provide you exactly what is in the report, and to kind of take a little bit of a different slant today, we're actually going to be looking back and comparing the report, the newest report, with the last report that was completed. So we'll be doing some looking at 12-month change in services rather than just the typical 6 months. So we want this information in this webinar to be useful for you as a provider. So please, if you have questions or suggestions as we go along, please make sure to add those to the Q&A section, and we can enhance this information going forward in future webinars. All right. So we'll do just a little brief overview here about what we're going to be covering. So we're going to cover our provider development activities. I'm going to ask Amy to help with that. We're going to talk about the status of current key performance measures and targets. Then we'll cover regional data, opportunities for development, next steps, and then any questions or suggestions there at the end. All right, so this is our mission. The Office of Provider Development continues to focus on developing and sustaining a qualified community of providers in Virginia so that people who have DD and their families have choice and access to options that meet their needs. So that's at the center of all we do. So all of the information that we're going over today will be available on the DVHDS website. On the provider development page, you see the link here on this slide. We will also make this recording available and get that posted as well. But you'll be able to find the most recent baseline measurement tool following this webinar, along with the most recent provider data summary report. The report itself will be looking at April of 2022 and October of 2022 compared to baseline of June of 2018. We continue to have our regional breakout and our sub-regional breakout to help you identify where service development makes sense based on the proximity of different localities next to each other. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, we are going to be doing a 12-month look back as part of this webinar. You won't see that information in the actual report, but this is an opportunity for us to start to look at trends over time. So we think looking at 12 months can shed a little light on trends more so than just looking at 6 months. All right, I'm going to ask Amy to step in and give us some updates from the Office of Provider Development.
All right, thank you, Eric. All right, so our Office of Provider Development has been quite busy. Our provider development activities from May 1st, 2022 to October 31st, 2022 included community resource consultants meeting with 23 unique providers seeking to diversify or expand service. So Region 1 had 4 providers, Region 2 had 4. Region 3 had 1 provider, Region 4 had 12 providers, and Region 5 had 3 providers. Next slide. The developmental disabilities waiver services being added or considered by current providers included workplace assistance, group home, we had 5 of those, group home with skilled nursing, therapeutic consultation, behavioral analysis and consultation, employment and community transportation, in-home supports, independent living supports, community guide, community housing guide, supported living, supported employment, 2 group day providers, 2 community engagement providers, community coaching, sponsored residential, services facilitation, and group home for children. Next slide. Some of the barriers we came across included difficulty locating correct training in Commonwealth of Virginia Learning Center, lack of availability of DD waiver slots, difficulty locating acceptable property for a home, and regulations not permitting a provider to expand services while on a conditional license. The Office of Provider Development continues to hold statewide provider roundtable meetings quarterly via webinar. The July 2022 Provider Roundtable was attended by 388 participants. And the October 2022 Roundtable had 357 participants. These meetings serve as a forum to exchange information about topics impacting providers and support coordination, as well as to provide space for shared learning. In May 2022, the Office of Provider Development began hosting a second Provider Roundtable meeting, also held quarterly on the month following the Provider Roundtable meetings, referred to as the Presentation Forum, to consolidate and share more in-depth training on a variety of topics. And the May 2022 Presentation Forum hosted 250 attendees, and the August 2022 Forum had 246. Next slide. The My Life, My Community provider database and provider designation process were launched on November 15th, 2019. All DD waivers and providers are encouraged to register for the database, which will serve as a centralized location for finding DD services in Virginia. As of April 2022, 213 providers registered and have DD professional membership in the My Life, My Community provider database. And collectively, we have 4 providers who hold badges in autism, accessibility, behavioral support, and complex health support. To date, we have 25 providers who have passed surveys. And for some of those providers, the next step is to submit the required evidential documents. And you can check your status on the database. And if needed, you can register on the location that is right there on My Life, My Community. The link is there on the website, or if you see on the picture on the page, if you go to mylifemycommunityvirginia.org, right up there in the top right-hand side, it says find a provider, and you can find the link to register your profile there. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the different badges that are available and the providers who actually have them. So first we have the autism badge. So providers with the autism badge are recognized with expertise in this area, and they offer services to people with autism. So these providers have submitted evidence to verify the following features are present in at least one service location: the use of evidence-based practices, access to a qualified behavioral interventionist, and a systematic approach for skill development. So the 2 providers who currently have this badge are Support Services of Virginia, Inc. and Wall Residences. There's also a behavioral supports badge, and providers with this badge are recognized with expertise in this area and offer services to people who have complex behavioral support needs. These providers have submitted evidence to verify that the following features are present in at least one service location. So access to a qualified behavioral interventionist, support planning that aligns with behavioral needs, and consistent methods of measuring the effectiveness of the supports provided. So the 4 providers who have this badge currently are CRI, Support Services of Virginia, Inc., the Choice Group, and Wall Residences. Next slide. Then we also have a complex health supports badge. Providers recognized with this badge have expertise in this area and offer services to people who have complex health support needs. So these providers have submitted evidence to verify the following features are present in at least one service location. So they have access to a registered nurse who are able to provide delegation and oversight, designing adaptations to the setting or the use of specialized equipment, and the use of health protocols to support safety and wellness. And that's CRI and Wall Residences who have this badge. And then the 4th badge that we have is an accessibility badge. And so providers with this badge have expertise in this area, and they accommodate people with physical disabilities. So these providers have submitted evidence to verify that they have these features in at least one service location. So they have a physical setting that can accommodate the use of a wheelchair, an accessible and sheltered entrance, and access to accessible transportation. And Wall Residences is the only organization that has submitted evidence for this as well. So if you are interested in any of these badges, please visit the My Life, My Community website and fill out the surveys. and submit the evidence once you've passed, and we would be glad to review what you submit and hopefully give you one of these badges as well. All right, thank you, Eric. Next slide. Okay, so Jumpstart funding. The Jumpstart funding program has awarded $149,377.95 during this reporting period, which is an increase of $45,000 over the last report. Funds continue to be available to assist providers with expansion and integrated services in all regions, and now includes skilled nursing, private duty nursing, children's sponsored residential and behavioral consultation. Program requirements have been revised to allow for submission of application prior to the identification of individuals intending to use the newer expanded services. And you can find information on how to apply, as well as Jumpstart funding requirements, on the provider development webpage, which there's a link here. Next slide. And our peer mentoring program, there are currently 14 trained and credentialed mentors across Virginia. Of the 14, 5 are actively matched with a mentee, 2 are inactive and 1 resigned. While the mentors are currently employed by one organization and another organization is in the process of onboarding as a secondary provider, mentors will be able to choose if he or she would want to be employed with both providers or maintain a singular employer. The provider information is shared with the mentee. He or she is able to choose the best mentor regardless of provider. The professional development training occurred on September 28th, 2022, and was attended by 6 of the active mentors. Prior to the training, mentors submitted topics of interest that were included both in the training as open discussion forum and/or scenarios. Both options provide the mentors a chance to learn and connect from one another while also having their questions and concerns answered. Mentors also receive a review of the 2-day original training they attended. In August, during the ARCS convention, a mentor and mentee assisted in building and presented the peer mentor supports training to a standing room group of participants. And at the end of the presentation, the 8 mentors who were present all participated in a speed matching activity with potential mentees. The ARC continues to support the Alliance for Self-Advocates meetings and is assisting the Virginia Board for People with Disabilities in efforts to improve information access for individuals and families. Okay, so the data on this slide displays the number of providers and our provider organizations providing therapeutic consultation behavioral services over their past 6 fiscal years. So the fiscal year 23 data is through early December 2022. So it should be noted that the counts presented may display individual practitioners that have a solo practice consisting of 1 behaviorist, as well as larger provider groups that have many behaviorists employed and are providing this waiver service. Next slide. And then this graph displays the number of providers and our provider organizations by region that are providing therapeutic consultation behavior services to individuals from fiscal year 2022 through 2023. So the data here are through early December 2022. When reviewing this data, it should be noted that numerous providers deliver services to individuals across multiple CSBs and regions in the state. So therefore, a total count of providers, in this histogram above, will exceed the total number of providers that are delivering the service. Next slide. So here you can see a comparison between the count of DSP supervisors completing orientation training from the last report to the current report. So you see that we've changed from 67 to 68 here, from April 22 to October 22. Okay, so a little bit about the virtual training that we continue to be doing. The Office of Provider Development held a 4th Provider Readiness Education Program, also called PrEP, in November 2021 to orient new providers to the DDU service system. This invitational training was attended by 37 providers. We're kind of in a stage where we're trying to get back into the we'll call it the real world, the post-pandemic world, and adapting back from the learning needs of the pandemic into the post-pandemic world. So we've continued to work to create virtual methods of providing training to providers throughout the Commonwealth. So on-demand Part 5 training, which launched in January 21 in the Commonwealth of Virginia Learning Center. So over 1,161 people have accessed that. Instructor-led virtual sessions have been attended by 271 people. The ISP development training pilot had 30 participants, and we've had several more sessions, and we're planning on continuing that. The Office of Provider Development plans on, well, that training itself has a practical application and coaching in addition to documentation requirement for DSPs as well. There were 2 webinars for support coordinators to review ISP 3.3 changes that were attended by over 1,200 people. There were HCBS regulations training attended by over 1,800 participants. And then there were also instructor-led remote versions of person-centered thinking and community connections classes held. And they're also still available with some also in-person classes that are starting to become available. Actually, Eric, that link is a former link that is no longer available. We just need to change those in the final slides. It's actually person-centered practices partnership.vcu.edu. And I'll find a way to put that in the chat for everybody.
Great. Yeah, and we'll update the slide before we post it.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on now and talk about our status with key performance measures. So the first one relates to indicating an annual 2% increase in the overall DD waiver population receiving services in most integrated settings. I recall from the last report, I believe we saw a 1% increase. So as of this report, we have a 1.7% increase in the overall population living in integrated settings and a 1.3% decrease for those in non-integrated settings. So we have yet to meet the 2%. We have come close. You know, at some point we're going to top out on this, I believe, but we are hitting what we were previously, which is slightly below 2%. In the report itself, we include the integrated living situations by locality chart. This goes across multiple pages in the report. It is sorted from most integrated to least integrated. So when you look at it, it's not alphabetical. But one of the things that you'll notice if you kind of go in and do some counting and figuring out where folks land, you'll see that 30% of the localities in Virginia have an integrated living result of 100%. 72% of localities have a result that is 86% or higher, and only 5% of the localities have an integrated living result below 60%. And I believe just a single locality is below 50%. So by and large, that gives you an idea about the level of integration across the state. So data continues to indicate that at least 90% of individuals new to the waivers, including those with support needs level 6 or 7 since FY16 are receiving services in the most integrated setting. You see the green check mark there, which is representative of the entire population that's being referred to in this measure, which is those new to the waiver. You'll see the result is 95%. For the current report. The table 2 below relates just to individuals with assist level 6 or 7. And you'll see the result for those folks is 94%. The actual measure itself is based off the first table. We use the second table to demonstrate that we are paying attention to those with level support needs level 6 and 7. The data summary indicates an increase in services available by locality over time. So the orange here represents provider counts, and the blue represents service type counts. And actually what we're counting is the number of localities out of 133 that experienced an increase in either providers in orange or service types in blue when compared to baseline, which is back in 2018. So you'll notice that there were 87.2% of the localities in April of 2022 that had an increase in provider counts over 2018. And then there were 88.7 when comparing 10/31/22 back to 2018. So that's a 1.5% increase in provider count. And we saw the same 1.5% increase in types of integrated services offered in those localities. In both instances, we gained 2 localities. Okay, this relates to DSP training and competency requirements. We use the quality service review data for reporting on these measures. Both of these measures are reported in the single visualization you see here. The PQR documentation is measure 4. And you'll notice that the result there in blue is 85%. So there were 85% of the providers who were reviewed through round 4 of the quality service review did not have an alert due to having insufficient documentation related to DSP training requirements. The orange is measure 5, and that represents the observed competency. So when the QSR reviewers do interviews, they also do observation of the DSPs, and 91% of those observed did not receive an alert for concerns with competence based on the items that are reviewed during the round. Those items are included in the report itself. So if you want to dig into that and understand exactly what they're looking for and observing in DSPs, you'll be able to see that in the report. So this is a little bit of a supplemental data set related to that measure that we just talked about. So you see the 85% and the 90.8%, which is the final result that you saw on the preceding slide. When you get into calculating the results for these measures, one of the things that we identified is that of those alerts that occurred for concerns with observed competency, which is the PCR or the orange, let me back up. The orange bar here, the 91%, that's the observed competency. 48 of the 66 occurrences were solely related to a medication side effects issue. And we have resolved that in updates to the ISP to clarify expectations for being aware of and knowing medication side effects. We've also updated the guidance for future rounds of the QSR process. Had that not been an issue, the result would have been 97.5% in terms of observed competence. But because we had this one interpretation issue around medication side effects, we ended up with a 90.8% result. So we're actually able now, as we go through and analyze the data, to understand what happened and whether or not there was actual concerns with competency or if there was a interpretation inconsistency across reviewers. So we're able to identify that and then rectify it in future rounds. So that should provide some insight in terms of how we arrive at the result that we arrive at. This is measure 6. It relates to at least 75% of people with a job in the community, either choosing or having some input into that job. We pull this data directly from NCI. This was included in the last report. We're waiting on the next report from NCI so we can get this updated. But historically, above target performance has been seen with this measure. These are pulled from the WAMS ISP data. This is measure 7 through 10. They are some statistics around ensuring that 95% of the people receiving residential services participate in the development of their own plan, that they have choose or help decide their daily schedule, that they chose or had some input into choosing where they live, or that they chose or had input into choosing their housemates. And we provide this data in 2 ways. So the yellow here is related to data for all individuals in the data set. And when we filter out individuals who are authorized for sponsored home, supported living, and group home, you get the result that you see in green. So the measures themselves say persons receiving services in residential settings. And so we provide the green as it relates to those in residential settings, but we also consider these important and do track the data for all individuals, which is what you see in yellow. These are the waitlist demographics in the current report. I did go ahead and look back at the last report. And so the box that you see on the right-hand side shows changes in numbers from the last report to the current report. So Region 1 added 43 people. That was added to the wait list. Region 2, 274. Region 3, 73, Region 4, 82, and the only decrease in folks on the wait list was seen in Region 5 with 23 less individuals. In terms of counts for the different priorities, there was 108 fewer people in Priority 1 in this report. There were an additional 405 people in Priority 2 and an additional 152 people in Priority 3. So that is looking a little bit about kind of trending over time from the last report to the current report. Also in the report, you'll notice that these arrows have been added to the current report to supplement the data that's here. There were no changes in terms of how this is collected or calculated. We just applied the arrows to demonstrate whether or not that number is higher or lower than it was reported in the last report. So these arrows are actually applied in the current report just next to the existing numbers to show whether or not the numbers are higher or lower. You'll notice that there's, for the most part, everything increased. There was a decrease in Region 1 around the BI waiver, which was a result of 37, which also brought down the total. There were fewer people in training centers, fewer people in fewer children in ICFs and nursing facilities, fewer adults residing in ICFs, and fewer adults in nursing facilities. And the training center census went down as well. There was a pretty significant increase in the number of licensed DoD providers. The result as of this report in November was 1,588. And the previous result in the previous report was about somewhere around 1,250. So that there was a pretty significant increase in terms of the number of licensed providers. Fewer providers of supported employment, no change in state-operated beds for children, a decrease in state-operated beds for adults, and there's the number of independent housing options consistent. You'll see increases almost across the board for all services that are licensed by DBHDS. Pretty significant changes in in-home services. I want to say there was in excess of 100 additional providers added to in-home services. Also increases seen in sponsored homes and other services as well. Data for children and youth residential. I'm actually visualizing the current report here as well as 4/30/22 compared back to 10/31/21. You'll notice that in yellow, it's showing you the distinct total count starting in 10/31/21 at the bottom with 24. In April, it went down to 21 and then rose to 29 in the current report. And so understanding where those changes occurred, they did not occur in group homes of 5 or more. You'll see that in October of 31, that blue square down there at the bottom represents one person or one child in a group home of 5 or more. But there are no children in a group home of 5 or more for 4/30/22 or the current report, which is 10/31/22. Most of the additions occurred in sponsored residential. So you can see they're represented in red, the shifting numbers that impacted the total, primarily occurring in sponsored residential. This is in the report itself. I think part of what I wanted to represent here is that in the report, you can see the actual names of the providers who offer residential services for children and the locations where they're providing those services across all 5 regions. If you happen to want to find a provider of children's residential, you can see the name here and figure out where they're operating. If you want to connect with the CSB, you can actually use the baseline measurement tool to identify which CSB works with which locality. So in this example, let's say you're looking for a provider in Floyd, you see Wall Residences is listed as a provider of services in Floyd. And if you're not sure which CSB is associated with Floyd, you can actually look in the baseline measurement tool, look up Floyd in the city county column, and you'll see that New River Valley is the associated CSB. So some of this information can work in tandem as you kind of try to connect or explore different options. Notable updates that are included in the report are listed here. So the number of DD providers went from 1,254 to 1,588 since the last report. Adults with DD residing in nursing facilities decreased from 338 in April down to 210 in October. Some of the feedback I received when I asked about that decrease was that the increased use of waiver slots that had been on hold due to the pandemic could be related to that decrease, but that's pretty substantial. Increases were seen across all regions for all waivers, with the exceptions of building independence, which I mentioned earlier, and there were actually 4 individuals who left BI waiver in that region. Authorizations for EHBS, or electronic home-based supports, increased by 89.8%. So in that 6-month period, we went from 49 individuals authorized to 93 individuals authorized for the service. And then finally, individual and SDM choice continues to be the primary barrier that people are, or reason that people are choosing less integrated settings. So we'll look at that in a few minutes in terms of the RST data. But individual and family choice continues to be, largely why people are choosing less integrated settings. All right, so we have a spotlight section that we added 2 or 3 reports ago. And a part of what we want to do this time is focus on using the SMART framework to develop support activities in Virginia's ISP. Part of what we want to do is make sure that the outcomes and the activities are measurable. And so using the SMART concept, we're going to walk through a few slides and kind of talk about how the SMART framework actually applies to what we do in Virginia for the ISP. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So you want to make sure that your wording under the SMART framework is explicit in what you are trying to accomplish, that it's quantifiable in some way, that it's realistic and within reach, that it's significant and aligned with broader efforts, and that it's time-bound with a deadline. So we want to figure out how that plays out in our ISP. So we're going to use SMART to do the development. So we're going to take an example desired outcome, which is Kayla tries more foods in order to have more variety in her diet. Okay, so that would be the outcome from the shared plan. We want a simple, observable statement that describes what will be attempted, and we want to be specific. So Kayla cooks dinner, right? That's something you can observe. You can observe Kayla cook dinner. So this is the simple support activity. But we need to go further than just stating the simple support activity. We have to make it measurable, and we have to define what type of support we're providing and what we're trying to accomplish here. So the ISP has space for entering a measure. And so we want to choose the type of support that we're going to provide. And there are 3 types of support described in the DD waiver manual. So there's routine support, there's skill building support, and there's health and safety support. So you have to make a decision and choose one, right? You want to pick one type of support for the development of that outcome. And remember that a person can have more than one activity per outcome. So if you're going to do one support that's routine and one support that's skill building, you would enter 2 separate rows under that outcome so that you would be able to kind of detail out in different measurable ways how you're accomplishing those supports. All right, so we have some examples here. This is the measure. So if we're talking about a routine support, we're really just wanting to know on a routine basis that the activity is occurring. So it's not complex. You basically take the activity statement and you add the frequency on the end. So Kayla cooks dinner weekly through her next annual meeting. So the instructions will talk about how staff support her to cook dinner. We are not trying to develop skills here. We're just ensuring that the activity is happening at the expected frequency. For the second one, if you decide, well, Kayla really wants to learn to cook. She wants to develop her ability to cook, and we're going to focus on skill building. So we have the example of Kayla gathers 3 needed menu items for dinner without support at least once per week for 6 weeks in a row. So this is the most complex measure out of the 3. It's the one that is required in many services, and there has to be at least one, but it really should be based around the person. So if somebody has a lot of interests and they're very active, you would expect to see more skill development or more skill building activities in that person's plan. Skill building is really based on that person's gifts and talents and what they want to learn. And we do encourage providers to keep it very simple into a yes and no format so that progress is easier to determine. So did Kayla gather 3 needed menu items today without support? Yes or no? And so picking one specific step, focusing on that, collecting data on that in a very simple way is what we're trying to get at with skill development. And then health and safety support, Kayla follows her mealtime protocol daily to ensure proper nutrition until it is removed by her physician. So what limits the time around health and safety support is that a qualified professional makes the decision that that support is no longer needed. So it would not be the residential provider that says, hey, we can stop your seizure protocol now. It would be a qualified professional who would make that determination, and the plan should reflect that that decision and where that decision comes from. Okay, so looking at the 3 examples that we just went over, are they achievable? So can Kayla get support every week with cooking her dinner? Can she gather 3 needed menu items for dinner without support at least once per week for 6 weeks in a row? So is that something that Kayla can do? So it may be worded differently for John or for Sarah, right? It could sound different based on who that person is, what their talents and gifts are, and what they want to learn and where they're at in terms of learning. So it's really shaping something that Kayla agrees to. Yes, that makes sense for me. Yes, that's achievable for me, and I want to work on it. And the same thing for following the protocol. Does that match the type of support the person needs in order to be healthy and safe? Is it relevant? So for each of these, does it look like the language for these makes sense for the activity of cooking dinner and makes sense in terms of whether it's a routine support, a skill building support, or health and safety support? Does it help the person have the life they want based on what their outcome is, right? And then is it time bound? And so as I mentioned, for routine supports, does the measure include how often the activity will occur through the target date? For skill building, it adds that criterion. So we're really looking at what will be observed, what skill will be observed, and how long it will be observed in order to ensure learning. So that time bound measure adds a criterion in the skill building support that's unique to skill building. And then for health and safety, the end of that is going to be when the qualified professional says that support is no longer needed. So that time-bound criterion is different depending on the type of support and the type of measure that's developed. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about get into some of the numbers and do the 12-month comparison for statewide aggregate provider counts and individual authorizations. All right, typically what you see in the report looks something like this, where we have the comparison of the last 6 months back to baseline in the current report based on where we've come from in the last 6 months. So here you see increases in all except for supported living. We are down 1 provider in supported living, but otherwise in-home, sponsored, and shared living. Shared living is consistent, but in-home and sponsored has seen increases. And if we compare the current report to the past report, what you're going to find is that we have 20 more providers of in-home supports. We have 2 more providers of supported living, We have 14 more providers of sponsored residential, and we are at the same level with shared living number of providers. And that's comparing October of 2021 to October of 2022. So that is a 1-year look back. Okay, and we also have charts in the report that reflect individual authorization. So this is sort of people counts instead of provider counts. So you'll notice some decrease there in sponsored residential, a little bit of decrease also in in-home supports, small decrease in shared living and supported living. So here's the current report, and you notice I've color-coded the services here to show you how the math works out, because they are not perfectly aligned above and below each other. But when you look at sponsored residential, we added 55 people to sponsored. 7 fewer people are authorized for in-home, 2 fewer people for shared living, and 3 more people for supported living. And there may be some up and down in April of 2022, but this is just looking at 2021 compared to 2022 in October. If we look at provider change in community coaching and community engagement, you'll see the yellow circle represents community engagement, and we gained 3 providers. And for community coaching, we went down 6 providers, but the nature of that service is such that it could be time limited. So that's not that surprising in terms of authorizations for community coaching. You'll notice the changes in people. There are actually 106 more people than a year ago receiving community engagement, and 25 fewer people receiving community coaching. So provider change for group homes, you'll see that less than 5 beds, when we added 24 new providers of less than 4 beds or fewer, and we have 6 fewer providers of 5 beds or more. So the more integrated settings are increasing and the less integrated settings have decreased in the past year. People authorized for group homes, you'll notice that 4 beds or fewer, we added 166 individuals into smaller group home settings. And in terms of larger group home settings of 5 beds or more, there are 221 fewer individuals in less integrated group homes over the past year. So this chart combines some of the adjunct services. So in comparing these numbers, you'll notice that for electronic home-based supports, that big jump we saw added 82 people compared to a year ago. We went from 11 individuals in October of 21 to 93 in October of 22. For community guide, we have 10 fewer individuals. For peer mentoring, we added 10, we added 10 individuals. Hold on, no, I'm sorry. For employment and community transportation, we added 10 individuals. And for peer mentoring, there are actually 2 agencies that offer peer mentoring right now. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But we know that there are 14 approved mentors and trying to make matches. So this is based on actual authorizations. So if no services are authorized at the time, the data is going to reflect 0. But we know that there are 14 active mentors working to make matches. But that is 1 fewer people from a year ago in terms of peer mentoring. So regional data and sub-regional data, again, in the report, when you look at one locality, you want to look at neighboring localities if you're thinking about expanding your services. So if you're looking in Spotsylvania, you might also want to look in Stafford or King George in terms of population and provider counts. So employment and community transportation, I didn't include everything that's in the report, but I think we need to focus on those services that need the most support, or the ones that kind of stand out as unusual in terms of change. So for this one, employment and community transportation, we hear from stakeholders a lot. They really want access to the service. And when we look at the current report, we see a little bit of activity, at least more than we saw previously. So in October of 2021, we had no providers of this service, but in October of 2022, we have 1 provider identified across 3 regions. So we are seeing a little bit of movement here, but we want to do what we can to kind of increase access to this service. On our website, which is listed here, the provider development page, you'll see that we have added the employment and training Employment and Community Transportation Service Provider Module video recording. We're going to be adding the slides here as well, but you can go on and see the video. We are working also with DMAS to discuss some of these less utilized services to figure out what barriers there are and what we can do to increase use of the services. So this is one of the services that we're in conversations about. The next service is peer mentoring. So as I mentioned, we have two agencies that are associated with offering peer mentoring. Provider team 2 is willing to work with any provider that's interested in becoming an administrative agency for peer mentoring. We can get you connected with the mentors out of the ARC as well. But you'll notice here the current report, we are down to one provider, whereas we had 2 in the last report. This is the ARC of Virginia's website, and I went on there and you can see that you can access the information about peer mentoring. And if you have someone in your services that wants to be a peer mentor, they can click on that link and fill out an interest form or reach out to Natasha Cooper at the email address that's listed there. This is the website here on the top of the slide where you'll be able to access this page and see the information about peer mentoring. And again, as I mentioned, you can reach out to your Team 2 CRC to discuss options. And then finally, shared living. So you'll notice that the changes in shared living, we actually went down a little bit because we lost one provider here in Region 2, whereas we have maintained in Region 3 and 4. But again, this is another service that's underutilized that we're working with DMAS to find out what can be done to increase access to the service. We do have some shared living information on the same web page that I showed you a minute ago. I did add a tag here that updates are pending because we are trying to get information from DMAS about how we can make this service more viable. And so as that updated information is available, we will update these resources on the web page. All right, so let's compare Community Guide from the last report to the current report. You'll notice a jump in providers in Region 1 and Region 2. So we went from 1 to 3 and 2 to 5 in those two regions. So saw some increasing in the past year of Community Guide use. We also saw some increases in supported living, a little bit of an increase in Region 4 and Region 5. We saw an additional provider in each of those regions. One service that we saw increase more substantially, I guess, would be sponsored residential, where we saw increases across 4 of the 5 regions, actually adding 7 providers in Region 5. Looks like 6 providers in Region 1, 1 provider in Region 2. Region 3 did not change, and then several providers in Region 4. So more interest in sponsored for sure. Same thing was seen with in-home. So we're seeing increases in interest in in-home services, and every region increased over the past 12 months in terms of the availability of in-home. All right, so now we're going to take a moment and talk about regional support team barrier data. And I took the current report and the last report and put them one over the other. So you'll notice that the last report is on the bottom, and that's showing Q1 and Q2 of FY22, and then the current report is Q3 and Q4 of FY22. So you're looking at a full fiscal year when you look at these slides. So this relates to barriers related to frequent hospitalizations. You'll notice in the last report, it was happening a lot more frequently in Q1 and Q2, and we started to see it trend downward in Q3. So that blue arrow is representing a downward trend in terms of the number of times frequent hospitalizations was identified as a barrier. And then for individual and SDM choice, or substitute decision maker choice, remember I mentioned this was probably the largest barrier and the reason folks are choosing less integrated settings. Consistently high numbers until we started to see some decrease in Q2 of FY22. We saw it jump back up in Q3, especially in Region 3. So we had 92 instances where individual choice was a barrier to more integrated settings, and 67 in Region 4. However, in the fourth quarter of FY22, substantially lower numbers across the board in terms of the number of times this was a barrier in the referral process. So we hope that trend continues. The report itself also includes more specificity around what those numbers mean in the charts. So for individual and SDM choice, if you want to understand which services were being sought, where this was a barrier, what you'll find is that most of the times when individual and SDM choice is a barrier, it's related to group home residential services or sponsored residential. So for the most part, folks are seeing a 5-bed group home or a 6-bed group home, and they're saying, that's what I want. I don't want to talk about anything else. And that's why that barrier tends to pop up a lot around group home residential. The sponsored residential, that elevated number of 11, there were 9 instances in the fourth quarter of FY22 in Region 4. So we might want to, I think part of addressing this is certainly educating individuals and families about more integrated services and making sure that they're aware that those options are available and making an informed decision about what service they select. So lack of behavioral expertise, you'll notice that there were some elevated numbers in quarter 1 of FY22 with Region 4 had 24 instances where there were concerns with lack of behavioral expertise. So if you're in Region 4, we do see a trending downwards here, but does this speak to a need for behavioral expertise in Region 4? And you can, as I mentioned, dig into understanding which services are encountering this barrier, and that can help kind of dig into why we're seeing it. You'll notice that there were elevated numbers in Region 1 in quarter 1, and then the highest number in quarter 3 there is 9 in Region 2. So some instances, but declining trend around lack of behavioral expertise. For medical expertise, same kind of story, elevated numbers in quarter 1 and quarter 2, much less of an issue in quarter 3 and quarter 4. So we are seeing a downward trend with lack of medical expertise in those quarters. Mental health expertise, a similar story with the exception of that 9 in Region 1 and quarter 4. So lack of mental health expertise was much higher in quarter 1 and quarter 2 like the others. Significantly lower in quarter 3, and then that little bump in Region 1 in quarter 4. So I'm not sure if it's related to a single provider, but we could dig into that and try to understand what's happening. If you're in Region 1 and you want to look at the data, just reach out to us. All right. So part of the reason we designed the baseline measurement tool the way we did was to provide a visual representation of change. And so everywhere that there is yellow, there is 0 providers. Everywhere that there is green, there is 1 provider, and everywhere there is blue, there are 2 or more providers. This is a visual representation of where we were at baseline in May of 2018 across 133 localities compared to November of 2022. So you'll notice that there is more green, there is more blue, kind of across the board. So we are seeing change in terms of the availability of more integrated services. There in red up on the upper right-hand side is less than 4 beds or fewer group homes. So that last column was not there at baseline. We are working to get that added in so that we can also compare that column across timeframes, but it's just a nice visual representation of change. So. All right, so this is the current gap data and the priority services in related regions. So remember, everywhere there's yellow, there's a 0. So shared living, peer mentoring, employment and community transportation, community guide. Not a lot of choice around electronic home-based services. Good coverage in terms of the availability of the provider that we have, but folks don't really have a choice when they only have 1 provider. So our ultimate goal is getting to blue as much as possible so that people have a choice of at least 2 or more providers of a given service. So this shows you the benefits planning, community guide, EHBS, ECT or employment and community transportation, independent living supports, peer mentoring, shared living, supported living, crisis supports, and skilled nursing. and the related regions. So, you know, if you're interested in expanding and offering some of these services, you can reach out to us and look at accessing Jumpstart funding in order to develop these services. You know, just because we identify these here in the slideshow and in the report doesn't mean that we are limited to offering Jumpstart money just for these services and these locations. You know, if you look at the data and you identified a need and you can justify the need, go ahead and apply for Jumpstart and bring that to us. And the committee will review it and see if we can support you to develop your service in that area. Next step, so we're going to continue a quality improvement initiative trying to increase employment and community transportation across all regions. We are reviewing all of our provider modules for all of the services and trying to get those finalized. We do want to take them through the provider issues resolution work group and get stakeholder input to try to add scenarios, examples, information that will make those modules more useful to providers before we call them final and start training on them. We will continue to work directly with providers to address gaps in service provision, especially around some of those newer services that we're struggling to stand up. We want to develop a planning guide for individuals and families, regardless of whether or not they have waiver services. So we're working with the community of practice around charting the life course to kind of move that along. And then we want to increase the number of providers in every region identified as having expertise to support people with complex needs. So working really to develop and increase the number of providers that have specialty designations that Amy talked about. All right. We do have a new playlist on the DBHDS YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube, you can actually click on our playlist, and we are adding old videos that were previously posted on Vimeo. They have to be converted and uploaded to YouTube, but we are working on that. One of the most recent ones you might be interested in is the PCISP updates version 3.4, which goes live on May 2nd. So the overview of those changes are included on YouTube now. All right, so we are at the end. Are there any questions, Amy, that jumped in that we can answer today? It looks like we have one. So it says,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, Caitlin says, is it possible to share again the breakdown of each region? This is which localities? Okay. All right, so Caitlin, we will post the report online, and you will be able to download the report once we get it posted. We'll try to get that out either today or the first of next week. And all of those sub-regions are listed out in the report itself, and they are also in the baseline measurement tool. So you can go in and filter by sub-area. So all that'll be available. Okay. All right. Any other questions for today? All right. Well, we appreciate your time. Again, if you have suggestions or ideas or want to see different information or have a spotlight new topics, just reach out to me or reach out to Amy, and we'll be glad to work on that for the future. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a good weekend. Bye-bye.